The train groaned, a beast of iron and steam surrendering to the end of the line. It hissed a final, weary sigh, its breath pluming white against the oppressive gray of the Wyoming sky. For Clara, the sound was a final punctuation mark on a life she no longer recognized as her own. She stood from the hard wooden bench, her movements stiff and small, as if trying to take up as little space as possible in a world that had already cast her out. The platform was a raw slash of timber against a world buried in white. Snow was everywhere, piled in great drifts against the station house, blanketing the rooftops of the distant town, and clinging to the branches of skeletal trees. The air was thin and sharp, a blade that slid into her lungs with every breath. It stole the warmth from her threadbare coat, a garment so worn it offered more memory than protection. Its gray wool was a match for her eyes, which held the flat, numb expression of someone who had seen too much and felt too little for far too long. She clutched a small, battered satchel to her chest, the sum of her worldly possessions. Inside was a change of linen, a tarnished silver locket with nothing in it, and a Bible whose promises had long ago turned to dust on her tongue. She was the last one to disembark. A man in a thick coat and bowler hat, the one who had arranged the passage, gave her a brief, impersonal nod from the station doorway. He did not look at her, but past her, toward a figure standing alone near a buckboard wagon at the far end of the platform. The deal was done. The debt was settled. She was no longer a person, but a parcel, delivered and awaiting collection. Her heart, a small, cold stone in her chest, expected nothing. It had learned the hard lesson of expectation and the pain that followed its inevitable disappointment. The man approaching was tall, built of the same unforgiving material as the mountains that loomed on the horizon. His coat was sheepskin, worn and dark with use. A low-brimmed hat shadowed his face, but she could see the hard set of his jaw and the absence of any welcome in his eyes. He moved with a long, deliberate stride, his boots crunching on the packed snow with a sound that seemed to measure out the final steps of her freedom. He stopped a few feet from her, his gaze sweeping over her from head to toe, a quick, dismissive inventory. There was no greeting, no ceremony. He was clearly not a man who wanted a bride. He was a man who had acquired one. "Clara May," he stated. It was not a question. She could only nod, her throat too tight for words. "I am Elijah Kane," he said, his voice a low rumble, rough like stones grinding together. He gestured with his head toward the wagon. "Get in." The ride was a study in silence. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon wheels, the soft thud of the horses' hooves in the deep snow, and the relentless sigh of the wind that swept down from the high peaks. The tension in the small space was a living thing, thick and cold as the air itself. Clara sat rigid on the hard wooden seat, her hands clenched together in her lap until her knuckles were white. She trembled, a constant, shivering tremor that was born of more than just the biting wind. It was the quaking of a soul worn thin by fear. Elijah Kane sat beside her, a mountain of quiet disapproval, his hands firm on the reins, his eyes fixed on the trail ahead. He did not speak, did not look at her, did not acknowledge the shivers that racked her small frame. The rhythmic rocking of the wagon was a cruel cradle, lulling her backward into the shadows of memory. The jolts on the rutted track became the jarring slam of a door. The wind's whisper became a different voice, sharp and laced with contempt. "Look at you," her first husband, Arthur, had sneered. His face contorted in disgust as she stared at the shattered pieces of a porcelain dish on the floor. "Useless. Can you not do one simple thing right?" She had not cried then. Tears only made him angrier. She had simply knelt, her hands shaking as she picked up the shards, one of which sliced a thin, bloodless line across her finger. The pain was distant, unimportant. It was the cold weight of his disappointment, his constant, simmering rage that had truly wounded her. He had never needed to raise a hand to her more than once. The threat was enough. living in the air of their small house like a sickness. He had taught her to be silent, to be invisible, to expect the back of his hand for a word spoken out of turn or a meal that did not suit his temper. When the fever took him, swiftly and without mercy, she had felt a terrifying, shameful surge of relief. But that relief had curdled into a new kind of fear. She was 19, a widow, and in the eyes of the town, a failure. The women who had once offered brittle smiles now whispered behind their hands as she passed. "Such a shame," they would murmur, their eyes filled with a pity that felt more like judgment. So young, he was a good man, if a bit stern. She must not have known how to be a proper wife. They did not know about the locked doors, the lonely meals, the nights she had spent curled on a thin rug by the cold hearth because she had displeased him. They did not know the hollowness he had carved inside her. They saw only a young widow who had failed her husband, a bad omen, a woman touched by an early death. The invitations stopped. The doors of respectable homes closed to her. She was alone, adrift, with her deceased husband's debts piling up like stones on his grave. The arrangement with Mr. Kane had not been a choice. It had been an escape hatch from a ship that was already sinking. A sharp gust of wind brought her back to the present. It tore at the thin scarf tied over her hair, and she instinctively raised a hand to hold it in place. As they passed a cluster of buildings that marked the edge of the town proper, a general store, a blacksmith, a saloon with fogged windows, she saw two women wrapped in heavy shawls, their conversation stopping abruptly as the wagon passed, their eyes, sharp and curious, fixed on her. One of them leaned toward the other, and though the wind snatched at the sound, Clara saw her lips form the words, "He's dragging a new girl up that mountain again." The phrase struck her with the force of a physical blow. A new girl. Again. She was not the first. She was a replacement, a tool, a pair of hands to fill a space left by another. Any lingering, foolish ember of hope she might have harbored for a different life, a kinder fate, was extinguished by the cold certainty of those words. She was just another piece in a story that had already been written, a story that did not end well for the girl being dragged up the mountain. The land grew wilder as they climbed, the trees thicker, the snow deeper. The world became a stark etching of black and white. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the wagon crested a ridge and a homestead came into view. It was less a ranch and more a wound in the landscape. A small, dark cabin hunkered against the wind, a plume of smoke struggling from its stone chimney. A larger, sturdier barn stood nearby, its timber weathered to a silver gray. Fences were half buried in snow, and the entire place had the look of something clinging to existence rather than thriving. It was a place of grim survival, utterly devoid of warmth or welcome. Elijah Kane pulled the horses to a halt near the barn. He swung himself down from the wagon with an economy of motion, his boots sinking into the snow. He did not offer her a hand. Clara waited a moment, then gathered her skirts and climbed down, her legs unsteady. The cold was more intense here, the wind a constant, keening presence. "The horses need tending," he said, his back to her as he began unhitching the team. "There is a water to be hauled from the well, firewood to be stacked. The goats in the barn need milking." He spoke as if reciting a list of chores to himself, not issuing instructions to another person. He finally turned to face her. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, were hard and unreadable. He gestured toward the barn with a leather-gloved hand. "Your work is here. Your place is here. I have my ways. You will follow them. You will not ask questions. You will earn your keep." He paused, and his next words landed like stones. "If you cannot follow orders, you will sleep in the barn. Understand?" Clara wrapped her arms around herself, the threadbare coat a pathetic defense against his coldness. She could only manage another small, pathetic nod. He seemed to take this as acceptance. Turning back to the horses without another word, she was dismissed. She found her own way into the dark, cavernous barn. The air inside was thick with the scent of hay, animals, and cold earth. A few goats bleated softly from a pen, their eyes luminous in the gloom. A ladder led up to a loft. Her place, he had said. She climbed the rough-hewn rungs, her satchel bumping against her side. The loft was vast and dark, filled with towering stacks of hay that smelled sweet and dusty. A small, grimy window high in the eaves let in a sliver of gray light. In one corner, a pile of old blankets and a flattened straw mattress lay on the floorboards. This was her room. This was her bed. He did not call for her. The light in the small window faded from gray to black. She heard him moving about below, the clang of a bucket, the soft sounds of him tending to the animals. She heard the heavy crunch of his boots as he walked from the barn to the cabin. Then, silence. The wind howled outside, a lonely, desolate sound that echoed the emptiness inside her. She did not move from her spot in the loft. She sat on the rough mattress, pulling the scratchy blankets around her, and stared into the suffocating darkness. Here, in the absolute solitude, the dam of her control finally broke. She did not sob or cry out. The weeping was silent, a hot, ceaseless flow of tears that tracked down her cold cheeks and dripped onto the rough wool of the blanket. She wept for the girl she had once been, for the woman she had failed to become, and for the hollowed-out creature she was now. She wept for a future that was nothing more than a long, dark corridor with no promise of a door at the end. She cried until her eyes were raw and her body ached with a weariness that went bone deep, eventually curling into a tight ball in the straw, letting the cold and the dark take her. Sometime later, she was wrenched from a shallow, restless sleep by a sound that was not just the wind. The entire barn shuddered. The howling outside had risen to a deafening, violent shriek. It was the sound of the world being torn apart. A blizzard had descended upon the mountain with the sudden fury of a predator. Snow and ice hammered against the walls, and the wind screamed through the cracks in the timber. Suddenly, the great barn door below was thrown open with a deafening crash. A whirlwind of snow and freezing air blasted into the space. A figure was silhouetted against the maelstrom of white. Elijah Kane. "Get down here!" he roared, his voice barely audible over the storm. Clara scrambled to the edge of the loft, her heart hammering against her ribs. He was not waiting. He started up the ladder, his movements swift and sure. He reached the top and his hands shot out, clamping around her upper arm like a vice. His grip was not gentle, it was steel. "Come on!" He did not give her time to protest or to find her footing. He half pulled, half dragged her toward the ladder. She stumbled, her thin shoes slipping on the hay-strewn floor. "Wait," she managed, her voice a weak thread of sound. "My things." He ignored her completely, forcing her down the ladder ahead of him. Her feet barely touched the rungs. At the bottom, he did not release her. He pulled her out of the relative shelter of the barn and into the full, raging force of the blizzard. The wind tore the breath from her lungs. Icy pellets of snow stung her face like needles. She could see nothing but a swirling vortex of white. He was a dark, immovable force, his grip on her arm the only thing keeping her from being swept away. He dragged her through the deepening snow, his long strides forcing her into a stumbling run to keep up. The cabin was only a short distance away, but it felt like miles. He kicked the door open and hauled her inside, slamming it shut against the raging storm. The sudden silence was as shocking as the noise had been. The only sound was the crackle of a fire in the stone hearth and the ragged gasps of her own breathing. The room was small and spare, furnished with a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, and a narrow bed in the corner. It was dim, lit only by the flickering firelight, but it was warm. The heat was a physical shock, a painful wave that made her skin tingle and her shivering intensify. Elijah released her arm, and she stumbled forward, catching herself on the edge of the table. She was soaked, her hair plastered to her skull, her dress clinging to her like a second skin. Water dripped from her, forming a small puddle on the wooden floor. She shook uncontrollably, her teeth chattering so hard her jaw ached. He stood by the door, watching her, his face a mask of shadows and grim lines. The snow melted on his hat and shoulders, dripping onto the floor around him. He said nothing, simply watched her shake. Clara wrapped her arms around herself, trying to still the violent tremors. But it was no use. The cold had settled deep in her bones, a frozen core that the fire's warmth could not seem to touch. But as she stood there, shivering in his silent, oppressive presence, something inside her shifted. It was a strange and terrible surrender. The physical cold was an agony. Yes, but it was a familiar one. It was the other cold, the years of silent fear, the biting loneliness, the hollow ache of being unwanted and unseen that had truly frozen her spirit. This cabin, this man, this storm. It was all just a different shade of the same winter she had been living in for years. Her shivering began to subside, not from warmth, but from a profound and sudden exhaustion. She looked up at him, her eyes meeting his in the flickering firelight. Her lips were blue, her face pale as bone. She opened her mouth, and when she spoke, her voice was a cracked, broken whisper that was barely human. It was the sound of something shattering. "I'm not cold anywhere anymore." Elijah Kane stared at her. The blizzard raged outside, rattling the windows and shaking the very foundations of the small cabin. But inside, a new and more terrible storm had just broken. He saw the truth in her deadened eyes, heard the echo of a desolation far deeper than any winter. A flicker of something, shock, confusion, something unnameable, crossed his face before the mask of stone slammed back into place, but he did not look away. He just stood there in the deafening silence, staring at the bride he had dragged in from the cold. The silence that fell between them was heavier than the blizzard still raging outside. It was a dense, awkward thing, punctuated only by the spit and crackle of the fire in the hearth. Elijah Kane stood by the door for a long moment, a dark monolith dripping melted snow onto the floorboards, his gaze fixed on Clara. She remained by the table, a fragile, shivering wraith, her strange declaration still hanging in the air between them. Her words had chipped away his stony exterior, revealing something uncertain beneath. Finally, he moved. He crossed the room to a large wooden chest at the foot of his bed, the floorboards groaning under his weight. He lifted the lid and pulled out a pair of men's woolen trousers and a thick flannel shirt. They were clean, but worn, smelling faintly of cedar and cold air. He tossed them onto one of the chairs without looking at her. "Those are dry," he said, his voice flat. He turned his back to her then, a deliberate and complete rotation, and occupied himself with stoking the fire, his broad shoulders blocking the light and creating a small pocket of privacy in the one-room cabin. The gesture was so unexpected it took her a moment to comprehend. He was giving her leave to change, and offering a sliver of dignity by turning away. Arthur would never have done that. Arthur would have watched, his eyes cold and assessing, making her feel like chattel. The thought sent a fresh wave of tremors through her, a chill that had nothing to do with the cold, with numb, clumsy fingers. Clara stripped off her wet dress, the sodden fabric clinging to her skin. The warmth from the fire was a blessing and a torment, making her nerve endings scream with life. She pulled on the dry shirt, the flannel rough against her skin. It hung on her like a shroud, the sleeves dangling far past her hands. The trousers were impossibly large, and she had to roll them up several times at the waist and ankles just to keep them from falling off. Dressed in the giant's clothes, she felt smaller and more lost than ever. "I am finished," she whispered to his back. He grunted in acknowledgement, but did not turn around. He pointed with the poker toward the narrow bed in the corner. "You sleep there. I will take the floor." He offered no further explanation. He spread a thick bear pelt by the hearth, lay down with a sigh that was more weariness than peace, and seemed to fall asleep almost instantly. leaving her alone with the fire and the storm and the deafening silence. The days that followed fell into a rhythm dictated by necessity and silence. The blizzard howled for 2 more days, trapping them inside the small cabin, 2 strangers orbiting each other in a cramped universe. Clara, desperate to prove she could earn her keep, took it upon herself to manage the inside of the cabin. She swept the floor with a worn broom, her movements quiet and efficient. She tried to cook, but the foreign stove and the meager supplies were a mystery to her. The bacon she fried turned to charcoal, filling the cabin with acrid smoke. The bread she attempted to bake was a dense, inedible brick. Through it all, Elijah watched her. He would sit at the table, sharpening a knife or mending a piece of tack, his eyes occasionally flicking toward her struggles. He never offered help, nor did he criticize her failures. His silence was a blank wall she could not read, and in some ways, it was more unnerving than Arthur's constant, simmering rage. At least with anger, she had known where she stood. With Elijah, she was adrift. When the storm finally broke, revealing a world scoured clean and buried under a fresh, blinding layer of snow, the silence simply expanded to fill the outdoors. She learned to milk the goats, her cold, clumsy fingers eventually mastering the task. He taught her, through gesture and monosyllabic commands, how to haul water from the well without slipping on the ice and how to split kindling without taking off a finger. They worked from sunup to sundown, moving in a silent, strangely coordinated dance of labor. He was a man of tireless energy, and she pushed her aching body to keep pace, driven by a primal fear of being found wanting, of being sent back to the barn, or worse, back to the world that had discarded her. One afternoon, while searching for rags to clean a spill, she opened a small drawer in a rickety washstand in the corner. Inside, nestled amongst some spare buttons and a spool of thread, lay the ghost of another woman. There was a scarf of fine, faded silk, printed with pale blue flowers. Beside it was a comb made of tortoiseshell, its teeth yellowed with age, a single crack running through its spine. Tucked in the corner was a small, leather-bound book of poetry, its pages softened and swollen from what might have been moisture, or perhaps tears. Clara stared at the items, her heart giving a painful lurch. This was her, the other girl, the one he was dragging up the mountain before her. She felt a strange kinship with this faceless woman, a shared fate that transcended the grave. She imagined her wearing the scarf, her hair smelling of the lavender sachet tucked beside it. She wondered if this woman had also cooked badly, if she had also shivered in the oppressive silence of this cabin. Clara closed the drawer gently, a quiet reverence for the life that had been lived here before her own half-life began. She asked nothing. It was not her place to disturb the dead. Elijah, for his part, was a fortress, but sometimes, in unguarded moments, she saw cracks in the walls. She would catch him staring out the window toward the high peaks, his expression so bleak and lost it made her own loneliness ache in sympathy. The land he worked with such grim determination seemed to be his enemy as much as his home. She came to understand a piece of it through a memory that was not her own. One evening, after a long day of clearing snow from the path to the barn, the exhaustion had settled deep in his bones. He sat by the fire, his supper untouched, his gaze lost in the flames. For a moment, the fire in the hearth became another fire, a roaring, hungry beast that consumed timber and hope with equal ferocity. He remembered the smell of burning pine, the terrible crackle and roar, the heat so intense it felt like the sun had fallen from the sky to scorch the earth. He remembered screaming her name, Annabelle, his voice raw and useless against the inferno. He had been in town, fetching supplies, delayed by a lame horse. By the time he saw the smoke and raced back up the mountain, it was too late. Half the cabin was gone, and she with it. They said it was a lamp, knocked over by the wind, but he knew it was the land. This place was too hard, too unforgiving. It took everything beautiful and broke it. The fire had not only taken his fiancée, it had burned the softness out of him, leaving only guilt and scorched earth behind. Weeks turned into a month. The silence between them began to change. It was still there, a constant presence, but it was no longer awkward or threatening. It had softened at the edges, becoming a shared space rather than a dividing wall. It was a language of its own, communicating in the clink of a spoon against a bowl, the steady rhythm of an axe splitting wood, the soft sigh of breath in the quiet of the evening. One night, she made a watery but hot soup from dried vegetables and a piece of salted pork. It was the first meal she had made that was not burned. She ladled a bowl for him as he sat by the fire, turning a small, silver locket over and over in his rough hands. It was old and tarnished, and he held it with a strange reverence, his thumb stroking the smooth metal. Clara approached him quietly, holding the steaming bowl. She hesitated, then set it on the small crate beside his chair. He did not look up, his attention still fixed on the object in his hands. The question rose in her unbidden, a soft, tentative thing. "Was she kind?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He froze, his fingers tightening around the locket. The silence stretched, drawn thin and tight. He stared into the fire, his jaw working. She thought he would not answer, that she had crossed a line she was meant to respect. She began to back away, her cheeks burning with shame. "Too good for this place," he finally said, his voice thick with a pain so raw it startled her. He snapped the locket shut and shoved it deep into his pocket, his movements jerky and violent. He picked up the soup bowl and began to eat, his gaze fixed on the flames, shutting her out once more. But the wall had cracked, and for a fleeting moment, she had seen the grieving man inside the fortress. The outside world intruded a few nights later. A frantic knocking at the door made them both jump. Elijah grabbed the rifle he kept propped by the hearth before pulling the door open a crack. A man stood on the threshold, his face red from the cold and his breath coming in white puffs. Clara recognized him as a rancher from a neighboring valley. "Cain?" The man, Jedediah, panted, his eyes wide with fear. "A word." Elijah stepped outside, pulling the door mostly closed behind him, but Clara could still hear their low, urgent voices. The Miller place," Jedediah was saying. "Took their horses, their supplies, everything. They say it is the Blackwood gang. Rode right through town like they owned it." "The sheriff?" Elijah's voice was tight. "Useless. He is either paid off or a coward. They are hitting the outlying homesteads now. You are isolated up here. Cain, you and your new wife." The man's voice dropped on the last words, and Clara flinched. "Be watchful." When Elijah came back inside, his face was grim. He bolted the door and added another heavy log to the fire, his movements tense. He pretended not to care, but she saw the way his eyes kept flicking toward the dark, frosted windows, scanning the impenetrable darkness beyond their small circle of light. The world was still a dangerous place, and its dangers were drawing closer. That night, her past came for her in her sleep. She was back in Arthur's house, the air thick with the smell of whiskey and his silent rage. He was standing over her, his shadow falling across her bed, his hand raised. She tried to scream, but no sound came out, only a choked, terrified whimper. She thrashed in the narrow bed, tangling herself in the blankets, the quiet whimpers turning into soft, muffled sobs. By the fire, Elijah heard her. He sat up from his bedroll, his body tense. He listened to her quiet, desperate cries, the sounds of a soul in torment. He thought of the wolves that sometimes howled on the ridge, their calls lonely and full of hunger. Her cries were like that, a lament for something lost, a deep and inconsolable sorrow. His first instinct was to go to her, to shake her awake, to tell her to be silent. But he remained where he was, a silent sentinel by the fire, listening until her weeping subsided into the quiet. Shuddering breaths of exhausted sleep. He did not know the words for comfort. He did not believe he had any right to offer them. So he did nothing. and the knowledge of his own inaction settled in his gut like a cold stone. The next morning, when Clara awoke, the cabin was filled with pale, early light. Elijah was already outside. The sound of his axe splitting wood a steady, rhythmic heartbeat in the quiet air. As she swung her legs out of bed, something on the windowsill caught her eye. It was a single rose. The petals were the color of dried blood, the stem brittle and dark. It was an old flower, preserved by the dry, cold air, something saved from a long dead summer. But it had been placed there deliberately, its head resting gently on the frosted pane. She knew, with a certainty that made her breath catch, that he had put it there. It was his answer to the nightmare he had overheard. It was his apology for a comfort he could not speak. She picked it up, its petals so fragile she was afraid they would turn to dust in her fingers. She carried it with her as she started the morning chores, its silent presence a small, warm coal in the cold expanse of her chest. When he came in for breakfast, stamping the snow from his boots, she found the courage to speak. "Thank you," she said softly, holding up the rose. He grunted, avoiding her eyes as he poured himself a cup of coffee. He seemed almost angry, his movements stiff and uncomfortable. "It is nothing, just an old thing from a box. It belonged to the past." He dismissed it, but the gesture lingered. He had given her something beautiful, even if it was broken. He had acknowledged her pain, even if he could not name it. From that day on, the tension between them began to change again. It was no longer the cold, hostile tension of strangers, nor the comfortable silence of companions. It became a fine, humming wire, stretched taut between them. Their gazes began to linger for a fraction of a second too long. He started to notice things about her, the way she bit her lip when she was concentrating, the dusting of freckles across her nose that were only visible in the morning light. One afternoon, while she was feeding the goats, one of the kids butted its head playfully against her leg. A small, involuntary laugh escaped her lips, a sound of pure, unburdened amusement. It was the first time he had heard her make such a sound. He stopped what he was doing, his axe frozen mid-swing, and just listened. The sound was so foreign in the grim quiet of his world that it startled him. The wire between them snapped one evening. He had torn his coat on a piece of fencing, a long gash in the sleeve. She had taken it from him without a word, sitting by the fire with her sewing kit, the one she had found in the washstand drawer. The cabin was quiet, the wind moaning softly around the eaves. She was focused on her work, her stitches small and neat. He sat at the table, watching the way the firelight caught the faint strands of gold in her brown hair. She finished the seam and reached for a pair of scissors to snip the thread. At the same moment, he reached across the small space between them to add a log to the fire. His calloused, work-roughened hand brushed against hers. It was the barest of contacts, skin against skin, but it sent a jolt through her like a lightning strike. She stiffened instantly, her whole body going rigid, the needle freezing in the fabric. It was an old reflex, a body bracing for a blow that always followed an unexpected touch. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting, but nothing happened. He did not pull away. He did not move at all. His hand simply rested there, its warmth seeping into her cold skin. It was not a threatening touch, nor a possessive one. It was just present, solid, a silent statement. Slowly, cautiously, she opened her eyes. He was looking at their joined hands, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. He held her gaze for a long, breathless moment. The world seemed to shrink to the small space between them, to the point of contact, to the heat that was blooming there. Finally, slowly, he withdrew his hand and turned back to the fire. She let out a breath she did not realize she had been holding. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, a wild, frantic bird. She snipped the thread, her hand trembling slightly. She folded the coat and set it aside, the mended sleeve a testament to the small tear she had just repaired in the fabric of their silence. Outside, In the deep, frozen dark of the mountains, a wolf howled, its call a long, lonely cry that was answered by another, and then another, until the night was filled with their wild, untamed music. But inside the cabin, the fire burned bright and steady. The storm was at bay, and in the shared quiet, something new and fragile and warmer than the flames was beginning to grow. The sharp edges of their shared silence began to wear smooth with the passing of the winter days. What had once been a threatening void between them, a space filled with unspoken resentments and anxieties, gradually transformed into a kind of sanctuary. Clara found she could breathe in the quiet of the cabin. She could listen to the steady rhythm of Elijah's movements, the scrape of his chair, the soft rasp of a whetstone on a blade, the even cadence of his breathing as he slept by the fire, and feel a sense of calm predictability she had never known. It was a silence that did not demand or judge. It simply was, a sturdy, unassuming vessel that was beginning to hold them both. Her world was the cabin, the barn, and the snow-swept yard between them. To fill the long, dark evenings, she began to explore the cabin's meager library, a few worn almanacs, a dry text on animal husbandry, and a large, leather-bound Bible resting on a high shelf. Its cover was cracked and its spine was softened with use. One night, huddled by the fire while Elijah mended a harness on the other side of the hearth, she opened it. The pages fell open to the Psalms, and she saw that the margins were filled with notes, written in a neat, careful hand that was nothing like Elijah's rough scrawl. The notes were not just scholarly observations. Beside a verse about green pastures, the writer had sketched a tiny, delicate drawing of a mountain wildflower next to the Song of Solomon. A passage was underlined, and in the margin, the hand had written, "Annabelle sees the world this way." It was a book that had been not just read, but lived in. A deep curiosity stirred in Clara. Tucked inside the front cover, on the page for family records, she found the name, Samuel Cain, born 1855. There was no date of death. This was his brother. Elijah's brother had lived here, in this very cabin. He had loved a woman named Annabelle, and he had found poetry in the Word of God. He was a man of gentle sensibilities, a stark contrast to the hard, silent man who now occupied his space. The knowledge settled in Clara, adding another layer to the complex quiet of the small home. She began to read the Bible every night, not just for the scripture, but for the glimpses of the man who had left his thoughts in the margins. One evening, as a Chinook wind rattled the windows, signaling a false spring, Clara sat with the open Bible in her lap. She had been reading a passage in Isaiah. In the margin, Samuel had written, "Even the fiercest storm must break." She looked up from the page and across the hearth at Elijah, who was oiling his rifle, his movements methodical and precise. "Your brother had a beautiful hand," she said softly, breaking the evening's quiet. Elijah's hand stilled. He did not look up, but his entire body tensed. "He spent more time with books than with an axe," he said, his voice a low rumble. It was not a compliment. "He wrote of a woman, Annabelle," Clara ventured, her heart beginning to beat a little faster. She was treading on sacred, unmarked ground. Elijah set the rifle down with a sharp click. He stared into the fire, his face hard and shadowed. "She was my betrothed," he said, the words clipped. "Samuel was to be my best man." The confession hung in the air, heavy with all that was unsaid. The woman of the silk scarf and the cracked comb was not Samuel's, but Elijah's, Annabelle, the fiancée who had died in the fire. "The book, it seems he cared for her too," Clara whispered, understanding the complex web of love and loss that haunted this cabin. Elijah let out a long, slow breath. "He cared for everyone," he said, and for the first time, a note of something other than bitterness crept into his voice. It was a pained, reluctant pride. "He was a better man than me, kinder." Clara waited. Sensing there was more, the wind moaned, a lonely counterpoint to the story unfolding inside. This land, Elijah began, his gaze distant, was a grant, given to our family for service, but it came with conditions. It had to be worked, improved. Samuel, he saw the beauty in it. I only ever saw the work. He paused, his jaw tight. He died not far from here, down in the South Canyon. A band of raiders came through. They hit the Jessup homestead, took what they could and set fire to the rest. He picked up a piece of kindling and threw it into the fire, the flames leaping up in a sudden, angry flare. Samuel was riding back from town. He saw the smoke. The Jessups were gone. But their little girl, Mary, she was hiding in the root cellar. Samuel found her. He could have ridden on, brought her back here. But he did not. He put her on his horse and sent it running toward town. He stayed behind, to slow them down. The cabin was utterly still, the only sound the hiss of the fire. They found him the next day. Elijah finished, his voice raw. He gave a little girl he barely knew his horse in his life. For this land, for a principle. That was Samuel. Clara finally understood. It was not just grief that weighed on Elijah. It was guilt. The guilt of the survivor. The guilt of a man who believed his kinder. Better brother had died for a piece of earth that he, Elijah, had never even truly wanted. He was living in the shadow of a ghost, on land paid for with a sacrifice he felt he could never honor. The knowledge changed her. It recontextualized his hardness, his silence. It was not a wall to keep her out. It was a fortress built to contain a world of pain. A subtle shift occurred in the days that followed. As she went about her chores, a new sound began to fill the quiet spaces of the ranch. It was a low, almost unconscious humming. At first, it was just a nameless tune, a simple melody that rose and fell with the rhythm of her work as she churned butter or scrubbed the floor. She had not even realized she was doing it until one afternoon. As she was gathering eggs in the barn, she caught Elijah standing in the doorway. He was perfectly still, his head tilted slightly, listening. His eyes, usually so guarded, had softened at the edges. A strange, unreadable expression was on his face. When he saw her looking, he immediately turned away, busying himself with a harness. But she had seen it. She had seen the way the simple, sad little tune had reached him, slipping through a crack in his armor. After that, she hummed more often. The outside world shattered their fragile peace on a Tuesday. A rider from town, a boy no older than 16, galloped into the yard, his horse steaming in the cold air. He handed Elijah a sealed envelope, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe at the grim reputation of the man of the mountain. Elijah took the letter without a word, broke the seal, and read it, his face growing darker with every line. When he was finished, he crushed the paper in his fist. "What is it?" Clara asked, her voice small. He did not answer her directly. He stared out at the unforgiving peaks, his knuckles white. "The town council," he said, his voice laced with venom. "That swine, Abernathy. The land grant stipulates it must be held by a family, that a man must be married to claim the full acreage his service provides. They are calling it into question. They are accusing me of fraud." "But we are married," she said, the words feeling strange and untrue on her tongue. The contract signed in a dusty office back east felt like a lifetime ago. "They say it is not a legitimate union," he snarled. "They say it is a purchase, a contract of convenience. They demand I present myself, and my wife, to the council to prove the marriage is real, or they will begin proceedings to reclaim the land." Clara's blood ran cold. The land, Samuel's land, the land Elijah carried like a penance. She saw the panic and rage warring in his eyes. "I will go with you," she said, the words out of her mouth before she could think. He turned on her, his eyes blazing. "No, you will stay here. It is no place for you. They are vultures. It is my name on that paper, too. Elijah," she insisted, a new and unfamiliar strength rising in her. If they question you, they question me. I will not hide in this cabin like a secret or a shame. I will go. He stared at her, a muscle working in his jaw. He saw not the timid, trembling woman he had collected from the train station, but someone else, someone with a spine of steel hidden beneath a threadbare dress. He wanted to forbid it, to lock the door and keep her safe from the town's cruel tongues. But he also saw the unwavering resolve in her eyes, and a part of him, a part he did not want to acknowledge, felt a reluctant surge of pride. He gave a sharp, angry nod. Fine, we ride at dawn. The journey to town was thick with a new kind of tension. It was not the silence of strangers, but the shared dread of allies marching into battle. The town looked just as it had the day she arrived, cold, gray, and unwelcoming. But now, she was not just a parcel to be delivered. She was Elijah Kane's wife, and she felt the weight of that title as they tethered the horses and walked toward the town hall. The council office was a small, stuffy room that smelled of stale cigar smoke and damp wool. A pot-bellied stove glowed cherry red in the corner. Behind a large desk sat a man with a balding head and small, shrewd eyes. Mr. Abernathy. He peered at them over his spectacles as they entered, his gaze lingering on Clara with open disdain. He took in her mended dress, her worn boots, and the faint, nervous tremor in her hands. Mr. Kane, Abernathy said, his voice oozing a false cordiality. And you must be the bride. He made the word sound like an accusation. From the East, I understand. Your accent is quite pronounced. Clara felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck. She said nothing, just stood beside Elijah, her eyes fixed on a crack in the floorboards. We are here, Abernathy, as requested, Elijah said, his voice a low growl. What is the meaning of this letter? A formality, I assure you, the clerk said smoothly, though his eyes glittered with malice. The Homestead Act has its rules. Certain members of this community have raised concerns about the nature of your arrangement. A marriage requires cohabitation, a shared life, not just a signature on a document bought and paid for. As he spoke, a man who had been loitering near the door, a known crony of Abernathy's, let out a snide chuckle. Heard he paid a pretty penny for her, the man said, loud enough for the entire room to hear. But you get what you pay for, I suppose. Look at her, just a paid bride in rags. Something in Elijah snapped. He took a step forward, his body coiling like a panther about to spring, a murderous fury contorting his face. You will hold your tongue, he hissed, his voice trembling with contained violence. Clara put a hand on his arm, her touch surprisingly firm. Elijah, do not, she whispered. He was shaking, his entire body a conduit for a rage so profound it terrified her. He looked down at her hand on his sleeve, then back at Abernathy's smug face. With a monumental effort of will, he held himself in check. He signed the necessary papers, his signature a furious slash of ink, and then turned and stalked out of the office, pulling Clara with him. The humiliation clung to her like a shroud. She had been weighed, measured, and found wanting by the entire town. She felt stripped bare, her poverty and her past laid out for all to see and scorn. Elijah was silent, but his fury radiated from him in palpable waves. He needed a drink, he needed an outlet. He headed for the saloon, telling her to wait with the horses. But she would not. She followed him, a small, determined shadow at his heels. The saloon was loud and crowded, thick with the smell of beer, sweat, and sawdust. Elijah pushed his way to the bar and ordered a whiskey. As he downed it in one gulp, a hulking shape detached itself from a nearby table. It was the man from the town hall, his face flushed with drink and arrogance. Well, well, the man slurred, swaggering toward them. If it is not the mountain man and his little mail-order whore, tell me, Kane, is she worth what you paid? That was all it took. Elijah moved faster than Clara would have thought possible. His fist connected with the man's jaw with a sickening crack of bone. The man staggered back, surprise and pain on his face, before crashing into a table, sending cards and glasses flying. The saloon erupted. Elijah was a whirlwind of motion, a force of pure, undiluted rage. He landed 2 more brutal punches before the man's friends jumped in, and the corner of the saloon devolved into a maelstrom of flailing fists and crashing furniture. It was over as quickly as it began. The bartender and 2 other men managed to pull Elijah off the now unconscious man. Elijah's lip was split, and his knuckles were raw and bleeding. But he stood tall, his chest heaving, his eyes blazing with a fire that made everyone in the room give him a wide berth. He threw a few coins on the bar, grabbed Clara's arm, and pushed his way out into the cold street. He did not speak as he led her to the livery stable. The sun was setting, casting long, cold shadows. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of hay and horses. He slumped down onto a bale of hay, the fight finally draining out of him, leaving him looking weary and broken. Clara found a bucket and a clean rag. She pumped some water, the squeal of the handle a lonely sound in the quiet stable. She came back to him and knelt in the straw at his feet. She dipped the rag in the cold water and gently, so gently, began to clean the blood from his split lip and his bruised knuckles. He flinched at her touch but did not pull away. He just watched her, his breathing evening out. Her touch was tender, her movements deft and sure. In the dim light of the stable, with the sounds of the town muffled outside, it was as if they were the only 2 people in the world. The touch was no longer accidental. It was a deliberate act of care, a silent communication that went deeper than words. They rode back to the cabin under a sky filled with cold. Indifferent stars. The silence was back, but it was different now, filled with the echoes of the day's violence and the memory of her gentle touch. Back inside their small fortress, the fire was nearly out. Elijah added logs until it was roaring again, the light dancing on the rough-hewn walls. Clara stood by the table, her arms wrapped around herself, watching him. The question that had been burning in her all day finally spilled out. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "You did not want me. You told me to sleep in the barn. You bought me like a goat or a sack of flour. Why would you fight for me?" Elijah did not turn from the fire. He stared into the flames as if searching for an answer in their depths. The muscles in his back were tight, his shoulders hunched. He was a man cornered by a question he did not know how to answer, by feelings he did not know how to name. He said nothing. The silence was his only shield. Clara's shoulders slumped. It was a foolish question. He had fought for his name, for his pride, not for her. She was a possession he was required to defend. That was all. Heart aching with a disappointment she had no right to feel. She turned to go to her bed. As she rose to leave, his hand shot out and caught her wrist. His grip was not rough or demanding. It was firm, undeniable. He gently pulled her back. She stopped, her back to him, her heart hammering against her ribs. He stood up slowly, still holding her wrist. He turned her to face him, his eyes dark and full of a tormented, unspoken emotion. Then, slowly, as if it were the heaviest thing in the world, he lowered his head and rested his forehead against hers. His brow was hot against her cool skin. He closed his eyes. It was not a kiss. It was something more intimate, more profound. It was a surrender, a plea, a silent confession of a need so deep it had no words. He smelled of wood smoke, whiskey, and the cold night air. Clara stood perfectly still, her breath caught in her throat. The girl who had once flinched from any touch, who had lived in terror of a man's anger, did not move. She did not pull away. She did not flinch. She simply stood there, in the circle of his grasp, and met his silence with her own. And in that shared, breathless quiet, with their foreheads pressed together, a silent promise was made. A silent question was answered. No words were spoken, but everything had been said. The world began to weep. The great frozen silence of winter broke apart, not with a sudden crack, but with a million soft sighs and trickles. Water dripped from the cabin eaves, a slow, steady heartbeat marking the passage of time. The mountainsides, once pristine white, were now streaked with the dark, wet earth emerging from its slumber. The snow did not vanish gracefully. It collapsed into a sodden, heavy mess, turning the yard and the paths into a mire of thick, greedy mud that clung to boots and pulled at the hems of skirts. The air itself changed, losing its sharp, crystalline edge and taking on the rich, loamy scent of damp soil and new life. The spring thaw had begun, and with it, a slow, messy, and uncertain thaw began in the small cabin on the mountain. It started in the kitchen, with the immediate threat of starvation no longer a daily concern. Clara found a half-empty sack of flour in the pantry that had been saved for emergencies. One afternoon, driven by a restless energy she did not understand, she decided to bake. Her hands, now calloused and capable from her chores, still felt clumsy with the dough. She had no real recipe, only a vague memory of her mother's movements from a lifetime ago. The resulting biscuits were pale, lopsided, and a little too dense, but the smell of them baking filled the cabin with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. When Elijah came in from the cold, stamping the mud from his boots, he stopped just inside the door, his nostrils flaring slightly. He looked from the plate of misshapen biscuits on the table to her, a question in his eyes. She watched, her breath held. As he picked one up, he turned it over in his hand, his expression unreadable, then took a bite. He chewed slowly, deliberately. She was certain he would say nothing, or worse, offer a gruff criticism. "They are good," he said, his voice quiet. He took another bite. The two simple words landed in her heart with the force of a symphony. It was the first compliment he had ever given her, the first piece of praise she had received from a man that was not a prelude to a demand. A shy, tremulous smile touched her lips, and she quickly looked down at her hands, a flush of pleasure warming her cheeks. He ate 3 more before he went back to his work. The work of the ranch changed with the season. The greatest task was rebuilding the long stretch of fence on the north pasture that had collapsed under the weight of the winter's snow. It was a 2-person job, and they fell into an easy rhythm, working side by side under the pale spring sun. He dug the post holes with powerful, efficient movements, while she hauled the new rails, her thin frame straining with the effort. The mud was their constant companion, a playful, treacherous third partner in their labor. One afternoon, as she was carrying a heavy rail, her boot slipped in a slick patch of clay. She cried out, pinwheeling her arms for balance, but the rail was too heavy, her footing too precarious. Before she could fall, he was there. He dropped his shovel and lunged, his strong arms wrapping around her waist, lifting her clean off the ground as if she weighed nothing at all. The fence rail clattered harmlessly into the mud. He held her suspended for a moment, her feet dangling above the ground, her back pressed against his chest. She could feel the solid, steady beat of his heart against her shoulder blades. Laughter bubbled up in her, a genuine, startled sound of surprise and relief. And then she heard it, a rusty, unused sound from deep in his chest. He was laughing, too, not a full-throated laugh, but a low, rumbling chuckle that vibrated through her entire body. He set her down gently on a patch of drier ground, but his hands lingered at her waist for a second longer than necessary. Her cheeks were flushed, her hair coming loose from its pins. She looked up at him, and the laughter died in his throat, replaced by something else, something deeper and more intense. The air between them grew thick and heavy. He cleared his throat and stepped back, turning to retrieve the fallen rail, the moment broken. But the memory of his laugh and the feel of his hands holding her steady remained. As the days grew longer, he took it upon himself to teach her other things, practical skills for a life on the mountain. The most terrifying of these was the rifle. "You need to know," he said one morning, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I am not always here. The wolves are hungry after the winter, and there are men worse than wolves." He led her to a clearing behind the barn, a line of empty tin cans set up on a fallen log. He placed the rifle in her hands. The shock of its heavy, cold weight nearly made her drop it. It was an object of pure, brutal function, and it terrified her. Arthur had owned a pistol he sometimes polished while he drank, the sight of which had always made her stomach clench. "It has a kick," Elijah said, his voice calm and low. "Hold it firm against your shoulder. Like this." Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely lift the barrel. She tried to nestle the stock against her shoulder, but her arms trembled with the strain. She could feel his eyes on her, and the shame of her weakness made it worse. "I cannot," she whispered, her voice failing her. He let out a soft sigh. "Yes, you can." He moved to stand directly behind her, his body a solid wall of warmth at her back, his chest pressed against her shoulders as he reached around her, his large, calloused hands covering her own small, trembling ones on the stock and barrel of the rifle. He adjusted her grip, his fingers firm and sure. His breath stirred the fine hairs at her temple as he leaned in close, his voice a low rumble by her ear. "Breathe," he commanded softly. "Look down the sight. Line it up with the can in the middle. Do not pull the trigger. Squeeze it, gently." The closeness of him was electric. It stole the air from her lungs and sent a bolt of heat through her veins. Every nerve in her body was aware of him. The rough texture of his shirt against her back, the faint scent of pine and leather, the solid strength of his arms enveloping hers. He was her anchor, her shield, with him holding her, steadying her. The rifle no longer felt like a threat, but an extension of his own power. She took a shaky breath, lined up the sight as he had instructed, and squeezed the trigger. The explosion was deafening, the recoil a hard, violent shove against her shoulder that would have sent her sprawling if he had not been there to absorb the force. The smell of gunpowder filled the air. One of the tin cans on the log spun into the air and landed in the mud with a soft plop. She had hit it. A giddy, disbelieving laugh escaped her. "I did it." "I know," he said, his voice still a low murmur in her ear. He did not move away. They stood there for a long moment, locked together, the rifle still warm in their hands. The world silent except for the frantic beating of her own heart. Their fragile new world was shattered on a day when the sun was shining. She was tidying the cabin, a task she now took a quiet pride in, when she decided to organize the contents of the tall wooden wardrobe where he kept his spare clothes, tucked away at the very bottom, beneath a stack of folded blankets. Her fingers brushed against a small, flat box. Curious, she pulled it out. Inside was a collection of odds and ends, a tarnished silver dollar, a dried eagle feather, and a single, folded piece of flimsy, yellowed paper, a telegram. It was dated from just a few weeks after her arrival. The ink was faded, but the words were clear. "Clara, May Kane, stop. Father has passed. Stop. Debts are cleared. Stop. You are free to return. A room awaits you here. Stop. Your cousin Esther." The paper trembled in her hand. Free to return. All this time, the reason for her exile, the debt that had sold her into this life, was gone. And he had known. He had received this message and hidden it from her. The warmth that had been blooming in her chest for weeks turned to a shard of ice. Every kind gesture, every softened glance, every shared silence was suddenly cast in a new, sinister light. Had it all been a lie? Had he kept her here, a prisoner, simply because he needed a wife for his land grant? She was still holding the telegram when he walked in. He saw it in her hand, saw the look on her face, and his own expression shuddered, the familiar mask of stone slamming back into place. "You knew," she whispered, her voice thick with betrayal. "You knew, and you did not tell me." He stood by the door, making no move toward her. He did not deny it. "It arrived the day after the blizzard broke," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Why?" The word was a raw wound. "Why would you hide it from me?" He was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on some point over her shoulder. When he finally spoke, his words were colder than any winter wind. "You were free to go from the start. That piece of paper changes nothing. This was a contract. It was never a cage." The calculated cruelty of his words struck her with the force of a physical blow. He was twisting it, making it her fault, her failure to understand the terms of their arrangement. She felt like the greatest kind of fool, a naive girl who had mistaken a shared roof for a shared heart. Without another word, she turned and fled. She ran to the barn, her vision blurred with tears, and clumsily saddled the calmer of the two horses. She had to get away, to breathe air that was not thick with his lies. She did not know where she was going, to town, to the east, to anywhere but here. She just rode, urging the horse into a frantic gallop down the muddy track that led away from the ranch. She was halfway to town when the world exploded into violence. A man on a dark horse burst from the trees, cutting her off. It happened so fast she barely had time to react. He was large and unkempt, his face covered in a grizzled beard, his eyes small and cruel. She recognized the stench of whiskey and unwashed bodies from the saloon, one of the Blackwood gang. He grinned, a flash of yellowed teeth. "Well now, what have we here? The mountain man's pretty little bride, all alone." He lunged for her reins. She screamed and pulled back hard, the horse rearing in panic. She kicked at him, her boot connecting with his leg, but he was too strong. He grabbed her by the arm, his fingers digging into her flesh, and began to pull her from the saddle. She fought, scratching and clawing at him, but it was useless. Then, a sound like a clap of thunder echoed through the canyon. The man holding her stiffened, a look of shocked surprise on his face. A dark, wet stain bloomed on the front of his shirt. He let go of her and slid sideways from his horse, hitting the mud with a heavy, final thud. Elijah was there, sitting on his horse at the top of the rise, the rifle still smoking in his hands. He looked like an avenging ghost, his face a mask of cold, lethal fury. He had followed her. He was off his horse in an instant, rushing to her side. She was still in the saddle, shaking so violently she could barely hold the reins. He reached up and pulled her down into his arms, holding her tight against his chest. She buried her face in his shoulder and finally let go, the terror and heartbreak of the day erupting in a storm of ragged, desperate sobs. He held her, his hand stroking her hair, his touch no longer hesitant but desperate and possessive. He murmured her name over and over, his voice thick with a raw fear that stripped away all his defenses. When her sobs finally subsided, she pulled back, her hand still clutching the front of his shirt. She looked up at him, her face tear-streaked and muddy. "I do not want to go," she confessed, her voice breaking. "Esther's house, it is safe, but it is cold. I am tired of running. This place, this cabin, it's warm." The admission hung in the air between them, a fragile and beautiful truth. He stared down at her, his eyes searching hers, and he saw that she meant it. She was not a prisoner. She was home. Back at the ranch, he wordlessly took the horses while she went inside. She stood by the fire, her body still trembling with the aftershocks of the attack. He came in a few minutes later, closing the door softly behind him. He walked to her and took a wet cloth, gently cleaning the streaks of mud and tears from her face. His touch was infinitely tender. He tilted her chin up, his thumb stroking her cheek. His eyes were dark, filled with a storm of emotions she could not name. And then he lowered his head and kissed her. It was nothing like she had ever imagined a kiss could be. It was not the rough, demanding kiss of a man like Arthur. It was a question and an answer, a prayer and a benediction. It was a culmination of every silent glance, every shared chore, every unspoken word that had passed between them. It was tender and deep and devastatingly gentle. It was the taste of wood smoke and winter and the promise of spring. When he finally pulled away, they were both breathless. She looked up at him, her heart a wild thing in her chest. "Do you want me to stay?" she whispered. "Yes," he said, the word a raw admission, torn from the deepest part of him. He rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closing for a moment. "But I have to warn you, Clara, I am not a good man. I am not my brother. I am not a man who knows how to love right." She reached up and touched his cheek, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. A soft, genuine smile touched her lips. "Then I will teach you how to stay warm too." Spring arrived not as a gentle guest, but as a messy, beautiful, and overwhelming force. The ranch, once held captive by the monochrome grip of winter, exploded into life. The muted grays and whites gave way to 1,000 shades of green as new grass pushed through the mud. The aspen trees on the hillsides shimmered with the pale, tender green of new leaves. The creeks, freed from their icy prisons, roared with the sound of meltwater. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and the promise of renewal. In the pasture, the 2 mares, their bellies heavy through the winter, gave birth to long-legged, clumsy foals that stumbled and fell in the soft mud, their newness a miracle against the ancient backdrop of the mountains. Clara, too, was planting things. One day, on a walk in the lower meadow, she found patches of Indian paintbrush and wild columbine. Carefully, she dug up the small plants, their roots clinging to the dark soil, and transplanted them to the barren patch of earth by the cabin's front door. It was a small, hopeful act, a declaration that this was no longer just a shelter, but a home, a place where beautiful things could be encouraged to grow. Their life together found a new rhythm, one dictated by the lengthening days and the shared work of the season. The physical space between them continued to shrink until it disappeared altogether. It did not happen with a formal decision or a spoken invitation. It was a slow migration, a natural and inevitable drift. One night, after a long day of work had left them both bone-weary, he did not lay his bedroll by the fire. He simply came to the narrow bed, pulled back the covers on the other side, and lay down beside her. She did not stiffen or protest. She simply turned onto her side to face him in the darkness. They did not touch, but she could feel the heat radiating from his body, could hear the soft, even sound of his breathing. It was a comfort so profound it almost made her weep. In the quiet geography of the night, they learned the shape of each other, the way he sighed in his sleep, the way she sometimes curled into a tight ball. It was not an act of duty. It was a quiet, profound intimacy, a silent acknowledgement that they were no longer 2 separate people weathering a storm, but 2 people building a life in the calm that followed. With this new closeness came a new vulnerability. The walls Elijah had built so carefully around his past began to crumble, not from a direct assault, but from the steady, gentle pressure of her presence. One night, as they sat on the small step outside the cabin, watching the last vestiges of pink fade from the sky, he finally spoke of the fire. "It was my fault," he said, his voice a low, rough thing, his gaze fixed on the darkening horizon. "The fire that took Annabelle. And Samuel." Clara's heart clenched. "Samuel?" she whispered. "But I thought he died in the canyon." Elijah shook his head, a slow, pained movement. "He was not in the canyon. That was the story I told myself, the story I told everyone. It was easier than the truth." He picked up a small stone, turning it over and over in his palm. "The raiders, they never came. That was a lie. Samuel, he died here, in the fire, with her." The confession was a stone dropped into the deep, quiet well of her heart. The story of the heroic sacrifice had been a fiction, a way for him to make sense of a senseless tragedy. "Annabelle was my betrothed," he continued, his voice thick with a guilt that was more than a decade old. But it was Samuel she loved, and he loved her. They were like two halves of the same song. I saw it, I knew it, but I was a proud, stubborn fool. The land grant, my name, our family's honor. I held on to her because I was supposed to, because it was my right. He finally looked at her, his eyes filled with a torment that stole her breath. The day of the fire, I had ridden to town for supplies. A wheel on the wagon broke. It took hours to fix. Hours I should have been here. Samuel was with her, helping her hang curtains she had sewn. When I finally got back, the cabin, it was an inferno. The sheriff said it was a lamp. But I will go to my grave believing they were going to tell me that day. Tell me that they loved each other and that I had to let her go. And a part of me believes the fire was a judgment on me, for my pride, for standing in the way of the only good and beautiful thing either of them had ever known. I should have been here, and Samuel, he should have lived. Tears streamed down Clara's face, silent tears for the two young lovers and for the man who had been carrying their ashes in his heart for all these years. She reached out and placed her hand over his, her fingers lacing through his. It was not a judgment. Elijah, she said, her voice firm but gentle. It was a tragedy, an accident. You cannot carry the weight of a misplaced lamp for the rest of your life. Samuel made his own choices. Annabelle made hers. They would not want you to live in the ashes of that day. They would want you to see the sun rise. You deserve peace. He looked down at their joined hands, then back up at her, his eyes searching hers in the gathering dusk. He did not say anything, but she saw a flicker of something in their depths. A painful, reluctant release. He leaned in and gently kissed her forehead, a kiss of gratitude, of acceptance. He was beginning to learn how to stay warm. But the town had a long memory and a cold heart. A letter arrived from Abernathy, colder and more official than the last. It stated that despite their previous appearance, the council still harbored significant doubts as to the legitimacy of their marriage. Whispers and rumors had continued. The fight in the saloon had only fueled the gossip. They were being summoned again. And this time, the letter implied, the council's decision would be final. Elijah read the letter, and a familiar, dangerous rage began to smolder in his eyes. He wanted to ride down to that town and burn it to the ground, but then he looked at Clara, who was watching him with a quiet, steady strength that had not been there months before. He saw the wildflowers she had planted by the door, now beginning to bloom in defiant splashes of red and blue. He thought of her laughter in the mud, of the taste of her biscuits, of the feel of her hand in his. He was not just fighting for a piece of land anymore. He was fighting for her, for them, for the home they had started to build. A new idea, a foreign and terrifying one, took root in his mind. Violence would not solve this. Isolation would not solve this. He had to face them, not as an angry mountain man, but as a member of the community. "We will host a picnic," he announced, the words sounding strange and clumsy coming from his mouth. Clara stared at him. "A what?" "A picnic," he repeated, gaining a bit of conviction. "Here, at the ranch, next Sunday. We will invite the whole town, the council, the preacher, all of them. Let them come up here. Let them see for themselves. Let them see us." A wave of pure terror washed over Clara. The thought of all those people, all those sharp, judging eyes, invading her sanctuary, was horrifying. She remembered the sneers, the whispers, the open contempt. "Elijah, I cannot," she whispered, her hands beginning to tremble. He came to her and took her hands in his grip firm and steadying. "Yes, you can," he said, his eyes intense. "You are the strongest person I have ever known. Clara Kane, you survived a winter on this mountain. You survived me. You can survive a few gossiping hens. We will do this together." His faith in her was a shield. She looked into his eyes and saw not a command, but a plea. He needed her. And so, She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and nodded. "All right, a picnic." The day arrived, bright and clear and terrifying. The ranch had been scrubbed and tidied to within an inch of its life. Clara had spent 3 days baking, her small oven turning out apple tarts, honey cakes, and 2 loaves of light, fluffy bread. The cabin was filled with the warm, welcoming scent of her efforts. Elijah had set up long planks on trestles in the yard, covered with clean canvas cloths. They started arriving around noon, in wagons and on horseback, a slow, skeptical procession up the mountain, the women in their starched Sunday dresses, the men in their stiff collars. They looked around at the small, rough-hewn ranch with critical eyes. Abernathy was there, his face a mask of smug condescension. The women gathered in a small, tight circle, their voices low, their glances sharp and assessing. Clara moved among them, her heart hammering against her ribs, a tray of her honey cakes in her hand. She offered them with a quiet, shy smile, her voice soft as she spoke to their children. She did not try to be charming or gregarious. She was simply herself, calm, kind, and unassuming. The men, initially gruff and suspicious, were softened by the simple, heartfelt hospitality. The children, free from their parents' prejudices, were charmed by the foals in the pasture and the wildflowers by the door. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the mood began to shift. They saw not a monster's lair, but a working ranch. They saw not a bought bride in rags, but a woman of quiet strength and gentle beauty who had managed to carve out a life in this harsh place. The turning point came late in the afternoon. Clara was pouring lemonade for a group of women when one of them, a stern-faced woman named Mrs. Gable, whose husband sat on the council, looked her up and down with a contemptuous sneer. "It is a fine spread. I will grant you that," she said, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "But all the baking in the world does not change what you are. Everyone knows he bought you to secure this land. You are nothing but a hired womb." The cruel words struck the air like a whip, and a sudden, shocked silence fell over the yard. Clara froze, the pitcher of lemonade trembling in her hand, the color draining from her face. All her old fears, all her old insecurities, came rushing back. Before anyone else could speak, Elijah was there. He moved to stand directly behind Clara, his hand resting on the small of her back, a gesture of unwavering support. He did not look at Mrs. Gable with anger. He looked at her with a calm, cold certainty that was far more intimidating. "You are right about one thing, ma'am," he said, his voice clear and steady, carrying across the silent yard. "I did bring her here under contract." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the council members, over the entire town. Then he looked down at Clara, and his expression softened into something no one there had ever seen on his face before. "But you are wrong about everything else." He turned his attention back to the crowd. "She is my wife, by contract or not, by choice now." The declaration was absolute. It was a vow, made not in a church, but under the wide-open Wyoming sky. It was a truth that resonated more deeply than any legal document. Clara's hands trembled, but for the first time, it was not from fear. A slow, brilliant smile spread across her face. It was the first time in her life she had ever felt truly, completely chosen. Abernathy looked flustered. Mrs. Gable looked mortified. A few of the other women had the grace to look ashamed. That night, after the last of the guests had departed, leaving behind a yard full of compliments on Clara's baking and a new, grudging respect for the man of the mountain, the cabin felt quieter than ever, but it was a peaceful quiet, a satisfied quiet. The fire burned low in the hearth as they stood facing each other in the center of the room. The day had stripped away the last of their defenses, the last of their pretenses. He reached out and gently untied the ribbons of her apron, letting it fall to the floor. Then, with a reverence that made her heart ache, he began to unbutton her dress, his fingers, usually so rough and capable with reins and tools, were slow and careful, as if he were handling the most fragile and precious thing in the world. He was touching her like a prayer. She, in turn, reached up and unbuttoned his shirt, her fingers tracing the hard lines of his chest. It was a slow, silent dance of revelation, of two people seeing each other, truly seeing each other, for the first time. They undressed each other in the flickering firelight, each touch a discovery, each glance a confession. He led her to the bed, and when he lay her down upon the clean, rough-spun sheets, he took his time, exploring the uncharted territory of her body with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. He was unlearning a lifetime of hardness, and she was unlearning a lifetime of fear. Later, as she lay cradled in his arms, the familiar blankets pulled up to their chins, he brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek. "Are you warm enough?" he whispered into the darkness. She snuggled closer against his chest, her body suffused with a warmth that went all the way to her soul. She tilted her head back and looked up at him, her eyes shining in the dim light. "I'm not cold anywhere anymore," she whispered, her voice trembling with a new and beautiful emotion. He held her tighter, his heart full. Outside, the wind began to howl, a familiar, lonely sound sweeping down from the high peaks. But inside the small cabin, the storm no longer reached them. They had found their shelter in each other. The peace they had fought for settled over the ranch like a warm, golden dust. Summer arrived in full force, chasing away the last of the mud and coaxing a riot of life from the soil. The foals grew sturdy, their once wobbly legs now carrying them in joyful, bounding leaps across the pasture. The wildflowers Clara had planted took root, spreading in a vibrant tapestry of color that softened the hard edges of the cabin. The world was loud with the buzz of bees, the chatter of the creek, and the soft lowing of the goats. It was the sound of a life being built, note by hopeful note. Their days were long and filled with the satisfying ache of shared labor, but their evenings belonged to them. Elijah had begun a new project, one he undertook with a quiet, meticulous focus. Using timber he had felled and planed himself, he was building a front porch onto the cabin, a proper one, wide enough for 2 chairs and a lifetime of sunsets. Clara would often bring him a cool drink of water as he worked, and he would stop, wipe the sweat from his brow, and watch her with an expression of such open affection it still made her heart skip a beat. This newfound peace, however, was as fragile as a wildflower in a high wind. It was shattered one afternoon by the arrival of a man on a fine black horse. He was not a neighbor. He wore a tailored city coat and a bowler hat, and he carried himself with an air of arrogant ownership, as if the very mountains belonged to him. "Elijah Kane?" he asked, his voice smooth and condescending. He dismounted without waiting for an invitation. Elijah came to stand beside Clara on the step, his hand instinctively resting on the small of her back. "I am Silas Croft," the man announced, gesturing vaguely at the valley below. "I own the CCC downriver. I am expanding my holdings. I am prepared to make you a fair offer for this land. It is too remote, too rugged for a real operation. Better to take the cash and set yourself up somewhere more civilized." Elijah's face hardened. "This land is not for sale." Croft chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. "Everything is for sale, Kane. It is just a matter of finding the right price or the right motivation." He pulled a sheaf of papers from his coat pocket. "I have had my lawyers look into your title. It is a conditional grant, a military patent. It has irregularities, vague boundaries, stipulations about continuous habitation by a legal family unit that your recent and convenient marriage only barely satisfies. It would be a shame to see it all tied up in court for years. A costly, messy business. My offer, on the other hand, is clean and final." The threat was unmistakable, a velvet glove wrapped around an iron fist. This was not about land. It was about power. Croft was a man who took what he wanted, and he wanted their home. The old Elijah would have responded with his fists. The old Clara would have shrunk back into the shadows, terrified. But they were not those people anymore. Elijah took a half-step forward, his body tensing, a low growl rumbling in his chest. But Clara laid a hand on his arm, her touch firm and steady. She stepped forward, positioning herself slightly in front of him, a small but unshakable barrier. She looked Silas Croft directly in the eye. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet, but it held the unyielding strength of mountain granite. "This is our home, Mr. Croft. We will not be leaving. Not now. Not ever. You should go." Croft was so taken aback by her audacity that he was speechless for a moment. He stared at the small woman in the simple dress, who was dismissing him as if he were a misbehaving child. He shot a contemptuous look at Elijah, as if to say, "You let this creature speak for you." He then tipped his hat with a mocking formality, climbed back onto his fine horse, and rode away, leaving a trail of silent menace in his wake. When he was gone, Elijah turned to Clara, a look of awe on his face. He gently touched her cheek. "I was ready to break him in half," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "I know," she said, her hand covering his, "but you cannot fight men like that with your fists. Elijah, they own the fists of other men. They own the courts. We have to fight him with something better." That night, she could not sleep. She lay beside him, listening to his steady breathing, and thought of the women in the town. She thought of their hard, judging eyes. But she also remembered the flicker of something else she had seen at the picnic, a flicker of recognition, a shared weariness. They were all survivors in their own way, trapped by circumstance, by widowhood, by contracts that had promised a new life but delivered a different kind of cage. The next morning, she made a decision. "I am going to town," she announced as she packed a small basket with a loaf of her bread and a jar of goat cheese. Elijah's immediate response was a scowl. "No, it is not safe. Croft." "This is not about Croft," she interrupted gently. "Not directly. This is about us, about our home. You trusted me to face the council. Now you have to trust me to face the town." He saw the iron resolve in her eyes and knew there was no arguing. He saddled her horse himself, his hands checking every strap twice. As he helped her mount, he held onto her hand for a moment longer than necessary. "Be careful," he said, his voice raw. "This place is not the same without you in it." Her journey to town was a pilgrimage of purpose. She did not go to the town hall or the sheriff's office. She went to the small, tidy house of a woman named Sarah Miller, a young widow whose husband had died in a mining accident the year before. Clara had noticed her at the picnic, a quiet, sad woman who had been kind to the children. Sarah was surprised to see her on her doorstep. She was wary at first, but Clara simply offered the basket. "I brought you something," she said simply. "I thought you might like it." Invited inside, into a home that was achingly clean and lonely, Clara did not speak of legal loopholes or land grants. She spoke of the cold. She spoke of what it felt like to be alone, to be judged, to be defined by your loss or your contract rather than by who you were. She spoke of being more than a widow, more than a hired bride. She spoke of being a woman trying to build a home in a world that was not built for her. And Sarah Miller listened, and she understood. By the end of the hour, Sarah had agreed to host a meeting at her house that evening. She sent her son to discreetly deliver the message to a handful of other women, the mail-order bride from Ohio whose husband treated her like a servant, the widow who had been forced to take in laundry to feed her children, even Mrs. Gable, the woman who had insulted Clara at the picnic, whose own husband, it was rumored, was a cruel and domineering man. That evening, in Sarah Miller's small parlor, a circle of wary, hardened women gathered. They sat in stiff-backed chairs, their hands folded in their laps, a wall of suspicion between them. Clara stood before them, her heart pounding. She was just a girl in a mended dress, a stranger who had been the subject of their gossip. "I know what you think of me," she began, her voice trembling only slightly. "I know the stories they tell, and they are true. I was hired. I came here because I had no other choice. My husband died, and his debts became my cage. I signed a piece of paper and crossed a continent to marry a man I had never met because I was desperate. They call me the hired bride." She paused, her gaze moving from one face to the next, seeing her own story reflected in their eyes. "But what do they call you?" she asked, her voice growing stronger. "A lonely widow? A desperate girl from the East? A spinster? A servant? They give us these names to put us in our place, to make us small. They draw lines around our lives and tell us we cannot step over them. A man named Silas Croft is trying to take my home now. He is using the law, and the fact that I am a hired bride, to say that my family is not real, that my home is not valid. He is trying to erase me, and I believe that if he can do it to me, he will do it to any of you." She saw a flicker of understanding in their eyes. The walls were beginning to crack. "I am more than a contract," she declared, her voice ringing with a passion she did not know she possessed. "And you are more than your loss, or your circumstances. We are women of this town. We build the homes, we raise the children, we tend the gardens. We are the threads that hold this community together. Even when the men who run it do not see us, my husband's name is on his land grant, but my heart is in our home, and I will not let a rich man with a sheaf of papers take that away from me, or from him." A long silence followed. Then Sarah Miller stood up. "My husband died for the railroad that made men like Croft rich," she said, her voice shaking with long-suppressed anger. "They gave me a pittance and a Bible. They will not take another thing from a woman in this town while I have breath in my body." One by one, the other women stood. They were sisters. They were widows. They were mail-order brides. They were a circle of support, an army in calico and wool. The next few days were a flurry of activity, with the help of the preacher's wife, who could read legal documents with a sharp and unforgiving eye. They went to the county records office. Clara, once terrified to even enter the town hall, now marched in with a quiet confidence that made the clerk, Mr. Abernathy, visibly nervous. They pored over the original survey maps and the text of the military patent, and they found it, a small, overlooked clause about improvements, and a handwritten addendum, signed by the original surveyor, clarifying that the family stipulation was intended to encourage settlement, and that any union entered into in good faith and with the intent to build a life was to be considered valid under the spirit of the law. Silas Croft's legal loophole was based on a willful misreading of the text. He was in league with Abernathy, who had conveniently overlooked the addendum. With their evidence in hand, Clara, accompanied by a delegation of 10 other women, filed a formal claim against Abernathy for malfeasance and against Croft for intimidation and attempted fraud. The hearing was before a traveling circuit judge, a stern, fair-minded man with eyes that missed nothing. The courtroom was packed. Croft and Abernathy stood with their lawyer, smug and confident. But on the other side of the aisle sat Elijah and Clara, and behind them, filling 3 entire pews, sat the women of the town, a silent, unshakable wall of solidarity. The judge reviewed the documents, listened to Clara's clear and simple testimony, and then turned his piercing gaze on Abernathy, who began to sweat profusely. The ruling was swift and decisive. The Kane marriage was declared valid, the title to their land clear and incontestable. Abernathy was removed from his post pending a full investigation, and Silas Croft was issued a stern warning against interfering with the citizens of that county ever again. They had won. The ranch was safe. As they walked out of the courthouse into the bright sunlight, Elijah pulled Clara to a stop. He looked not at her, but at the women who were smiling and congratulating her. He then looked back at his wife, the quiet, trembling woman in rags he had collected from the train, who was now the respected heart of a community. "You are the strength of this house. Clara Kane," he said, his voice thick with a pride so fierce it was almost painful. You are the strength of this whole damn mountain. That evening, he finished the porch. He put the final nail in as the sun was setting, then disappeared into the barn. He returned a few minutes later, carrying a porch swing fashioned from smooth, pale aspen wood, suspended by 2 thick ropes. He hung it from the new rafters, then took her hand and led her to it. They sat together, the swing moving in a slow, gentle rhythm. The air was cool and sweet. He put his arm around her, and she rested her head on his shoulder. They did not need to speak. The peace they felt was more eloquent than any words. They sat there for a long time, hand in hand, watching the stars prick the deep velvet of the sky. 2 people who had found their place in the world, together. A few weeks later, Sarah Miller and her young son rode up for a visit, bringing a basket of early summer vegetables. As they sat on the new porch swing, drinking cool water, Sarah looked at the blooming wildflowers and the sturdy, peaceful cabin. "You know," she said with a gentle smile, "when you first came here, the rumors were terrible. Everyone said you were just a hired bride." Clara looked out at the pasture where Elijah was mending a fence, his familiar form a comforting anchor in the landscape. She thought of the cold, frightened girl on the train, a girl who felt like a ghost from another lifetime. She smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that reached all the way to her eyes. "I was," she replied softly, "but I stayed because I'm warm now." The afternoon sun bathed the ranch in a soft, golden light. The wildflowers danced in the breeze from the pasture. Elijah looked up, saw her watching him, and smiled. Love, not winter, lived here now. Thank you for listening to our story around the campfire. We encourage you to comment with where you are listening from, so we can all connect with one another. Please subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts with us in English.